in Iraq, I got used to seeing failure on a truly spectacular level. Failure that belonged directly to certain well-known American leaders, but also what one saw in Iraq was what I think of as the arteriosclerosis of our institutions. It wasn't just an individual failure. It was an institutional failure. From a Congress and the executive to the military, the intelligence world, my world, the media, the for-profits, the non-profits, they all failed in Iraq. And the reasons are many, and that's not the subject of my talk. But when I came home and began to write about things going on in my own country, it was 2008, and that was a historic year. The presidential campaign made history, but so did the economic crisis. And what one saw was one pillar after another of the American economy collapsing. Real estate, commercial banks, investment banks, car manufacturers. To me, it all felt apocalyptic. In fact, it's kind of nice to hear the voices of Willie Nelson and Bob Dylan, which recall the 30s, because I was in a 30s kind of mood in 2008. And in fact, when I began to think about the unwinding, the writers I had in my head were 30s writers, especially John Dos Passos, whose great USA trilogy is unfortunately rather forgotten today, but is one of the great works of American modernism. And maybe we'll talk about it later. This mood is the kind of thing that makes me want to write a book. But I had to ask myself, what kind of book can I write? I'm not a scholar. I'm not licensed to write scholarly history. And this is something that clearly had been going on for decades before these collapses took place, so one would need a historical point of view. And I'm also not a policy expert. I'm not really a pundit. In fact, I'm not an expert on anything. I'm a journalist. So don't ask for answers tonight, because I don't have any answers, seriously. You can ask, but I won't have them. What I am is a journalist and an ex-novelist. And what I like is writing narrative. My nonfiction has always had a first-person narrator at the center. But in this case, I felt my own presence in the narrative, explaining, guiding the reader, analyzing, would be kind of like the guy sitting next to you at the movie theater who keeps talking to you about what's happening on the screen. It would be annoying and distracting, and you'd want to tell me to shut up. And that's because the story I wanted to tell was so big, really the story of what happened to America in my adult lifetime since the late 70s. The best way to do it, I thought, would be simply to find American stories in the country that would tell the story for me, through the voices, the points of view, the eyes, the nervous systems of ordinary people. So I began traveling around the country, mostly to out-of-the-way places like the Carolina Piedmont region, where tobacco used to be the basis for the economy. The old industrial city of Youngstown, Ohio, where steel was king. And the brand new subdivisions around Tampa Bay, Florida, which were turning into ghost subdivisions as people abandoned their houses with the foreclosure crisis. In general, I've found that when you take on a really large subject, the only way to do it is to illuminate it through small dramas. You can't get your arms around a subject as big as this by simply trying to embrace it. You have to find a kind of side door in. So I met a handful of people during these travels whose lives would allow me to tell the story of America over the past 3 decades. People who come from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different economic classes, and who are absolutely particular in their own lives and compelling as individuals, but who also, to some degree, could be seen as representative. And I also wanted to tell the story of a handful of the era's celebrities, 10 of them to be exact, from different sectors: finance and business, entertainment, politics, culture. Because in a way, we live in a celebrity era, and you can't understand America today without understanding how our most famous and most powerful and most wealthy shape the way Americans live and think and talk, for better and for worse. And then I had to bring all these different stories, half a dozen ordinary people, including the entire Tampa Bay region, which is a kind of character in itself, and 10 celebrities, into a coherent narrative. And that was the really hard part, because I'm a nonfiction writer. It's all true. I couldn't do what Dickens would do and have them all end up knowing each other. And for it to cover 35 years, that was the really hard part. Now, despite the absence of a first-person singular narrator, there is a kind of argument in the Unwinding, an implied argument. And it comes with a caveat, because it's an argument that's about a historical decline. And it's the kind of argument that's made by people after they turn 50, which is a disaster that happened to me while I was working on the Unwinding. So just to start with a warning, it may be that I'm simply talking about myself here. Now, one question any work of narrative has to answer is where to begin. In this case, it's somewhat arbitrary, but not entirely. So as a thought experiment tonight, I'm going to suggest to you that about a generation ago, in or around 1978, American character changed. And the America we know today began to take shape back then. And it was a period not unlike the present and the recent past. A long, unhappy war had ended. America was trying to pull back from its overseas commitments, pulling inward. There was an economic crisis, a kind of constant crisis and contraction, a mood of pessimism, discontent, political upheavals, a fundamental sense that things had gone wrong in the country. And back then, the reaction to this mood gave us the next era, which is what I call the Unwinding. So very quickly, what were the trends that began back then? One, deindustrialization, the loss of millions of blue-collar jobs across the industrial belt of the United States in places like Youngstown, Ohio, where within 5 years, 50,000 steel jobs disappeared in a small city and the surrounding community. Second, and with the loss of industry, was the decline of unions. Back then, 25% of the private sector workforce was union. Today, it's less than 7%. Third, the two big success stories of the Unwinding era started back then. One, the rise of Wall Street, the financialization of the economy as a percentage of GDP, which has doubled since the late 70s. And two, the triumph of Silicon Valley and the Silicon Valley model for the economy. I'm from Silicon Valley, although it wasn't called that when I was growing up. It was called the Santa Clara Valley, and it was a pleasant and boring and very middle-class place. And today, it's one of the most unequal parts of the country, of a very unequal country. In the year I graduated from high school, which was 1978, California voters passed something called Proposition 13, which began a long process of draining away public funding for public schools. In a sense, I got out just in time, because when I was in school in California, the public schools were excellent, and the only kids who went to private schools were the fuck-ups who had somehow messed up in public school. Today, private schools are where wealthy families, can I use that word in a Dutch church? I actually asked my host that earlier, and I was given the green light, so sorry if I've offended anyone either here or in the cosmos. Proposition 13 signaled a pulling away from support for public institutions and really for civic life itself in my own California. And at the very same moment, the Apple II, the first really popular personal computer, came on the market. And I'm going to argue later on that I think these two trends are somehow connected to each other. Fifth, in the late 70s came really the first big presence of lobbying in Washington as a force in our political life. Until then, lobbyists had been essentially cigar-smoking, whiskey-drinking guys who had bull sessions with politicians in their offices after hours. But with the 70s came the big rise in spending on elections and the big rise in spending on lobbying that has now become an avalanche, a tsunami of money that in the next year's presidential election will reach many, many billions of dollars. Apparently, Hillary Clinton's campaign has the intention of raising something like $1.5 or $2 billion, and that's become normal, partly because of Supreme Court decisions which have taken away whatever statutory limits had been placed rather weakly and rather lamely on the role of money in politics. I call it organized money, and really it's the default force in American life, and at times it's held at bay, but today, as during the age of the robber barons, the limits are gone, and organized money is by far the most powerful force in Washington. And I should mention that I'm going a bit quickly here because I want to get to our conversation, but these themes are very much a part of the Unwinding, and there are characters in the book who very much live out these themes. There's a woman from Youngstown, Ohio named Tammy Thomas, who's an assembly line worker and who watches the city around her go into a death spiral after the end of the steel industry. And she holds on to one of the last blue-collar jobs, and with that is able to raise 3 kids by herself and keep them out of the gangs and keep them alive and safe. And there's also a guy named Jeff Connaughton, who is a political idealist who goes to work for Joe Biden when Joe Biden is a kind of glamorous young senator and gradually becomes disillusioned with both politics and with Joe Biden, who, when he can't remember Jeff's name, calls him dumb fuck, which is sort of representative of how Biden treated his staff. And Connaughton leaves politics and does what any smart, young, mid-level Washington staffer would do. He becomes a lobbyist, and in lobbying makes millions of dollars, and then has a kind of crisis of conscience and goes back into government with the 2008 financial crisis. Sixth, American politics began to change in 1978. It was the year Newt Gingrich was elected to Congress, and really the beginning of the new right coming to Washington as a big political force. And with that came what we now know in day-to-day life as the polarization of American politics. In the 70s, every major bill had bipartisan support before it passed. Today, it's unthinkable. In the 70s, the filibuster was used maybe 10 times a year, 15 times a year. Today, it's used every time the Senate takes a vote, and that's because of polarization and a real loss of restraint, of self-restraint on the part of our politicians, especially those on the right. Immigration has changed the country in this period. In the 70s, America was 5% immigrant. Now it's 13% immigrant, and that's because of a change in the law. And finally, the mother of all these trends, which is economic inequality, which began to go up in the late 70s. At that point, the top 1% had 8% of the country's income. Today, the top 1% has 25% of the country's income. And to put it in more human terms, the 6 surviving heirs of the Walmart fortune have more wealth than the bottom 43% of all Americans. And that's a simple way to think about how grossly lopsided the rewards of the capitalist system have become in the last generation. Now, the interesting thing to me is that if you measure and try to graph all of these trends, and there are ways to measure things like political polarization, income inequality, polarization, deindustrialization, the decline of unions, immigration, financialization, and the rise of special interest money, the lines somehow come out almost the same, which leads you to think that somehow these phenomena must be connected. So, what is behind them? Some of the factors are worldwide changes that are under no one's control. Globalization, the inflation and oil shocks of the 70s, the growth of foreign competition after a long period of American dominance, technological changes that have favored the most educated Americans and have been hard on those with skills requiring less education, and have been positively cruel to those with neither education nor skills. But other advanced economies in Canada and Europe have experienced the same global factors with somewhat less extreme results. The effects have been more extreme in America than anywhere else. And this takes us beyond just blind and impersonal economic forces to our politics and our culture. The unwinding has meant the end of the deal that once existed among Americans. And the end of that deal was man-made. It came from human choices. Some of those choices came in the form of laws, policies, but to me, maybe the most important changes were in manners and morals, social codes, norms of acceptable behavior, taboos, standards of responsibility and self-restraint. So what was that deal? It was an unwritten social contract among Americans, signed in invisible ink by the leaders of government, business, and labor, and applied to elites and ordinary people alike. It gave them a slice of the pie and a place in the sun. I call it the period of the Roosevelt Republic. Now, we all know that those years contained a lot of injustice. If you were black or female or gay, America made very little room for you. Yet the same period had the means of redressing the very wrongs it contained. For example, strong government, enlightened business, and activist labor were key supporters of the civil rights movement. Now, maybe the Roosevelt Republic was just a 50-year exception to the main American story, a product of the Cold War, of global dominance, in which we had tax rates and a level of state intrusion that Americans will never again accept. But it was also an ethos, and it took an active effort to tear it to pieces. The deal guaranteed that the benefits of the economic growth following the Second World War were distributed more widely and with more shared prosperity than at any time in human history. The deal said that a CEO did not get paid $80 million for 10 weeks of work, which was the good fortune of the head of Time Warner last year. The tax code restricted the amount of wealth that could be accumulated in private hands and passed from one generation to the next, thereby preventing the formation of an inherited plutocracy. And related to this shared prosperity, political participation reached an all-time high. At the same time, American elites were playing a role that is now almost unrecognizable. They actually saw themselves as custodians of national institutions and national interests. Now, the heads of banks and corporations, universities, law firms, foundations, and media companies were neither less nor more personally venal, meretricious, or greedy than their counterparts today. Human nature doesn't change, but they rose to the top in a culture that put a brake on these traits and certainly didn't glorify them. Hypocrisy is underrated. Today, instead of elites, we have celebrities. They dominate the landscape like giant monuments to aspiration, fulfillment, and overreach. They're as intimate as they are grand, and they offer themselves for worship to ordinary people searching for a suitable object of devotion. In times of more widespread opportunity, the distance between these gods and the mortals closes. The monuments shrink closer to human size, and the lives of American celebrities become gossipy diversions. But they loom larger in times like now, when inequality is soaring and trust in institutions is falling, and the normal paths of upward mobility are blocked. Celebrities no longer rise with their fellow Americans, they rise from them. They're like their own superclass. They hang out at the same TED Talks, big idea conferences, fundraising galas. They appear on the same talk shows. They invest in one another's projects. They wear one another's brand apparel. They champion one another's causes. They marry one another, and they cheat on one another with one another. They can be found in every sector, including some that don't seem particularly glamorous, like banking, Jamie Dimon, computer engineering, Sergey Brin, real estate, Donald Trump, media, Arianna Huffington, biology, Craig Venter, restaurants, Alice Waters. There's often a quality of self-invention to their rise. Mark Zuckerberg went from awkward geek to the subject of a Hollywood hit. Sean Carter turned into Jay-Z, and Jay-Z became Jehovah. Martha Costyra became Martha Stewart, and then Martha Stewart Living. The person evolves into a persona, and then a brand, and then an empire, with the business imperative of grow or die. This process substitutes celebrities in place of institutions. Instead of robust public education, we have Zuckerberg's botched rescue of Newark's public schools. Instead of a vibrant literary culture, we used to have Oprah's book club. Instead of federal investment in basic scientific research, we have Eric Schmidt's Ocean Institute. Celebrities either buy institutions or disrupt them. After all, if you are the institution, you don't need to play by its rules. Zuckerberg's foundation myth begins with a disciplinary proceeding at Harvard, which leads him to drop out, and then found a company whose motto is move fast and break things. Jay-Z's history as a crack dealer isn't just a hard luck story, it's celebrated by fans and not least himself as an early sign of hustle and smarts. It's a kind of preparation for business. Martha Stewart's jail time for perjury simply proved that her will to win was indomitable. These new celebrities all live by the hacker's code. Ask forgiveness, not permission. They obliterate the old distinctions between high and low culture, serious and trivial endeavors, profit-making and philanthropy, which leads to the phenomenon of being famous for being famous. So an activist singer, Bono, is given a lucrative role in Facebook's IPO. A patrician politician, Al Gore, becomes a plutocratic media executive and tech investor. One of America's richest men, Michael Bloomberg, ruled its largest city. The inevitable next step is for Kim Kardashian to join the board of a tech startup, host a global poverty awareness event, and write a bestseller of popular neuroscience. These celebrity monuments have grown so huge that they dwarf the aspirations of ordinary people who are asked to yield their dreams to the gods, to flash their favorite singer's corporate logo at concerts, to pour open their lives and their data on Facebook, to adopt Apple as a whole lifestyle. Our stars dangle before us the myth that in America anything is possible if only you have the right attitude, which is also Oprah's philosophy. But we know that they aren't really inviting us to think that we can be just like them. Their success is based on leaving us behind. When the middle class hollows out and inequality reaches levels such as we see today, people begin to believe that the game is rigged. It's something I heard everywhere I went when I was working on the Unwinding, and that they no longer have a place at the table, that they're disposable. Some of the characters in my book feel exactly that way, and during their adult lifetimes, the period of the book, the character of America has changed. It's become more free and less fair, more diverse and less secure, more inclusive and more stratified. There are more choices, but they exist in a world without solid structures. There's more social equality and much less economic equality. The upheavals of the Unwinding have come with an intoxicating vision of freedom and democratization, of flattening hierarchies, discarding the old elites, and empowering individuals. This is tech talk, but you find it in all the important sectors: politics, business, finance, technology, even culture. Think of the writer and reader in the age of Amazon's self-publishing platform, with Jeff Bezos promising to end the gatekeepers. Or the reporter, the professional reporter, in the age of the citizen journalist on Twitter. But across the sectors, the result is always the same. When you tear down old structures, wealth and power become concentrated in the hands of fewer people. The old institutions might have been cozy and corrupt, but they provided a check on the law of winner take all. For some Americans, the winners, the surface of life has dramatically improved. Think of all these things that were not available in 1978. HBO, Lipitor, Google, FedEx, pour over coffee, E-Trade, Amazon Prime. Life has gotten quite nice for some Americans. But the institutions that underpin a healthy democracy have fallen into a state of decadence. We have all the information in the universe at our fingertips, while our most basic problems go unsolved year after year. All around, we see dazzling change, but no progress. History never rewinds. There is no going back to the Roosevelt Republic. What I see in America today is a great deal of public unhappiness without an overarching idea to tap and channel it in a positive way. Some people thought Occupy Wall Street was that idea. Some thought it was the Tea Party. Some thought it was Barack Obama. But none of them have been able to jump on the wild horse of public opinion and ride it. They've all been thrown off. Instead, there are thousands of small eruptions of energy around the country, local ideas of change and reform, most of them in places and involving people whom we've never heard of. But without an overarching idea, Americans tend to fall back on the individualism that is perhaps the oldest and deepest current in our life. And I'll end tonight with a little reading from the book about the main character in the book. My feeling is he's the main character, a guy named Dean Price, who is a son of the rural tobacco and textile country in North Carolina. His father was a kind of fire and brimstone Baptist preacher and a bitter racist who committed suicide. And Dean spends his whole life trying to escape the shadow of what he calls his father's poverty thinking. He wants to be a self-made man. He has a vision of being an entrepreneur. And his first effort, which is to open a chain of truck stops and fast food joints along Route 220 in North Carolina and Virginia, succeeds for a while, and then it begins to go bad. And at the point where we're going to read, where you'll hear me read tonight, Dean is about to make a kind of religious turn in his life from old-fashioned fast food and imported fuel to biodiesel, from waste restaurant oil and canola. He hasn't quite made this change yet, but he's on the cusp of the big transformation in his life. Once, driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hardshell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with him to Cleveland County and heard the sermon that his father had given for the audition back around 1975, so that decades later he recognized the church, and he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived, how they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways as his father never had. And the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Some nights he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to his floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned in the bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayadan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. Dean was an optimist, a latter-day Horatio Alger. It's true. There was no Armageddon without the rapture. He fervently believed that out of this collapse would come a new birth. A whole new way of life would emerge, right here in Rockingham County and around the country. In a decade or so, the whole landscape would be different. There might be no more Walmarts. Exxon and Archer Daniels Midland would be moribund, brainless, obsolete. If gas went up to $6 or $7 a gallon, instead of centralization and long-distance trucking and everything on a huge scale, the new economy would be decentralized, local, and small-scale. Rural areas like the Piedmont were on the cusp of a great revival, and everything they needed was right at hand, riches in the fallow fields. In the age of riverboat travel, there'd been a grist mill every 50 miles or so where people produced flour using water power. In the coming years, small fuel refineries and meat processors would spring up every 50 miles on Route 220. Instead of mass production, it would be production by the masses. The future would take America back into the past. In 20 years, nothing would be recognizable. It would be a difficult transformation, but on the other side lay an absolutely beautiful America. Okay, let's talk.